Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Naushin Premji, and I'm the Project and Events Coordinator at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the first day of the Historical and Contemporary Migrations of Central Asian Muslims, History, Culture and Identity Conference. A special welcome to all of you who are joining us online through our live webcast, and to some of our panelists who are joining remotely from across the world. Throughout the conference, there will be an opportunity to participate in a Q&A for each panel. For those of you who are joining us online, please submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will, of course, endeavour to get through as many questions as we possibly can throughout the event. A couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. We are not planning on having a fire drill today, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way through the doors on my left and on my right, and down to reception where our exit point is Lewis Cubitt Square Garden, so just outside the front doors where you entered. For security purposes, please can I ask everyone to ensure that their lanyards and badges are on display, and if those can be kept throughout the 2 days and returned at the end of each day, again, upon registration, you'll pick those back up. And also, if you could please take a moment to ensure your mobile devices are on silent. For those of you inquiring about the Wi-Fi, we have signage around the room which contains the username and password. And for those of you with a special speaker's lanyard, you'll also find the Wi-Fi details on the back. We also have a lovely book stand where you can browse, view and purchase a selection of our IS publications, which have been especially discounted for this conference. So, if you've been eyeing up any publications, now is the time to act. Finally, there will be an opportunity to attend at the end of each day a guided tour of the Aga Khan Centre. If you are interested in attending, please either see me or a member of the organising team for more information, but those do happen at the end of each day. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Zayn Kassam, Director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, for a few words before we begin, followed by Dr. Hakim Elnazarov, Head of the Central Asian Studies Unit at the Institute for Ismaili Studies and the convener for this conference. But first, please join me in welcoming Professor Kassam.
Thank you, Naushin, for letting us know that there is no fire drill planned today, in addition to everything else. So good day to everyone who is present here today in person or joining us online. I would like to welcome you to this, I would like to say it is the inaugural conference on historical and contemporary migrations of Central Asian Muslims. As many of us know, the 20th century was a century of migrations, and that has continued into the present, the 21st century. So according to a World Bank report for 2023, 184 million people, including 37 million refugees, live outside the countries of their nationality. Migration studies has now developed into a field in its own right. And I'm delighted to see that we are hosting a conference on migration in order better to understand how migrations shape and affect both the origin and host societies. And most importantly of all, how migrants themselves experience migration and what it does to notions of selfhood, community, and nation. There are also needs to understand what are the push factors driving migration, what are the pull factors, the processes migrants go through before they arrive into their host countries, and how they are settled, as well as the role of governmental, civil society, and faith-based organizations to aid in the resettlement efforts. How do migrants keep alive their connections to their originary homelands while creating new ones, and so forth? Perhaps we will hear about these aspects of these elements relating to migration during the 2 days of this conference. Before I end my welcome, I would like to express my thanks to our events team, and to Dr. Hakim Elnazarov and the Central Asian Studies Unit for all their efforts in organizing and hosting this conference. May I now turn it over to him? Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Kassam. It also gives me a great pleasure to welcome our dear guests, speakers, colleagues, students, and our viewers online to the Aga Khan Center and to our conference, Historical and Contemporary Migration of Central Asia Muslims, History, Culture, and Identity. During the inauguration of Aga Khan Center, His Highness the Aga Khan highlighted two values which inspired the construction of this building. One is the value of architecture as a source of inspiration and illumination, as he put it. And we hope that our guests here will take this opportunity of visiting Aga Khan Center and view and explore the architecture of this building with its garden and spaces of contemplation and learning, which draws inspiration from Islamic architecture. The second value which His Highness emphasized is the value of education as a force for cooperation and healing of the world. End of quote. Our conference on migration of the Central Asian Muslim is also inspired by this vision. We created this forum to explore one of the pressing issues of our time, migration. As a global phenomenon, migration has been at the center of polarized political debate in many countries, particularly in the West, as the main destination of migrants and refugees from countries with predominantly Muslim population. In recent decades, we have also witnessed an increasing number of migrants and refugees from Central Asia, including Afghanistan. The causes of these migrations are manifold, ranging from socio-economic, political, to family and individual decisions. The environmental issue, such as climate change, is also becoming an important factor in the displacement of the people in many regions, including Central Asia and their migration abroad. There is ongoing debate also about the place of migrants in societies. The attitude towards migrants varies, and we see an increase of xenophobia against migrants in some countries. The proponents of migration emphasize a positive contribution of migrants to society and argue about the importance of migration in the formation of multicultural and pluralistic society. A few years ago, in 2020, a first migration museum was opened in London, in Lewisham Shopping Centre, near the place I live. The founder of this museum, Barbara Roche, former British migration minister, made the case for migration museum for Britain almost 20 years ago. And you can imagine how long it took to gain public and government support to open the migration museum in London. The museum explores how the movement of people to and from the UK across ages has shaped the British as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. When I visited the museum, what struck me was a stand with the heading, "What is home?" And people who visited the museum were writing on cards what home meant to them and hang them on the board. The most frequent words I noticed on the board were security, love, peace, family, which attest to basic human instincts and inspirations which people share regardless of their origin and background. Our conference on migration also aims to present the aspirations of the migrants on the basis of research and explore driving forces behind migration in both historical and contemporary perspective, highlighting the transformation which migrants undergo, their struggle for peace, security, and identity preservation. We have 23 presenters in our conference representing 9 countries. They will present their research on various facets of migration from perspectives of various disciplines, primarily focusing on narratives of migrants their educational experiences, their relations with other communities, their efforts to maintain their religious and ethnic identity in multicultural society. We hope that this conference will not only enable the speakers and participants to present and exchange ideas, but also develop relations and cooperation in the field of migration, thereby promoting and fostering the knowledge and understanding of migrants from Central Asia. Thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to your talks and contribution. Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee, Senior Research Scholar at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, is our keynote speaker today. Dr. Keshavjee has a vast experience of cross-cultural and educational activities, particularly in the field of mediation and human rights. He is a lawyer by profession with degrees from Queen's University, Canada, and the University of London, where he obtained his PhD in law and conflict resolution, with particular focus on Islam and Muslim communities. Dr. Keshavjee is a member of the advisory panel on mediation to the Secretary General of the International Social Service of Switzerland, and has keynoted important conferences on mediation in places as diverse as Lithuania, Argentina, France, India, and Canada. He has spoken at the French National Assembly in Paris and the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He was the first Canadian to receive the Gandhi King Ikeda Peace Award for the global contribution to peace and human rights education. Unknown to many, Dr. Keshavjee is reputed to be the largest respected commentator on the 19th century Indian diaspora, which is reputed to be the largest diaspora in the world. In 2017, he wrote his first short story book entitled Diasporic Destruction, New Faces in New Places, which received critical acclaim in Malaysia, where it was published. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee, our keynote speaker.
Good morning, everybody who is here today, and good day to all from wherever in the world we are joining this particular program. When Dr. Hakim Elnazarov asked me a fortnight ago whether I would be happy to deliver the keynote address for your conference this morning, I gladly accepted without any demur. It was only when I read the papers he had left with me that I realized to my utter dismay that the focus was exclusively on Central Asia. For a fleeting moment, I asked myself, what do I, the descendant of a twice displaced Indian minority community from Africa, have to offer to a group of established scholars of Central Asian studies? Suddenly, it dawned on me that some of the seminal questions this conference aims to address are questions that we raised some 60 years ago in Africa, and we are still asking today. And though the circumstances in the South Asian diasporic context in Africa were different from those that the people of Central Asia faced at the dismantlement of the Soviet Union in 1991, there are many similarities and overlaps, and indeed, there is a great deal that we can learn from each other about the issues that give rise to migrations and those that emerge from migrations. In addition to my own diasporic journey and my perennial search for my identity, I also stand before you today as an individual who was personally involved in the post-Civil War rehabilitation program in Tajikistan in October 1993. His Highness the Aga Khan very graciously designated me to join the Aga Khan Foundation delegation to Gorno-Badakhshan, led by Dr. Robert Middleton and Mr. Pat Peterson of the Aga Khan Foundation, Geneva. Our remit was to assess the situation in the field with a view to transforming humanitarian assistance into a long-term development program. There were massive issues to take into consideration. My own task as the international coordinator for religious education boards at that time at the Imam's Secretariat in France was to ascertain the religious education needs of the Ismaili community in Tajikistan as this new process of transformation was beginning to take place. Migration was an important factor at the time, though it was not in the form in which we know it today in the Ismaili community in Tajikistan. Thousands of Pamiri Tajiks living and studying elsewhere in the country were beginning to migrate back to the Pamirs because of the civil war raging in the country. They returned to their families whose very existence was threatened by a blockade where food was weaponized and Badakhshan was under siege with its people fighting for their survival. The Aga Khan mobilized a number of international agencies and working closely with a few neighboring republics brought about emergency relief to all the people of the Oblast of Gorno-Badakhshan, regardless of religion, race, gender, or other difference. As I traveled across the length and breadth of the region in a jeep, going from valley to valley, I began to gain an insight into the fascinating history of this area. All this was related to me by Shahzada Mohamed, a respected elder of the Ismaili community, working under the direct tutelage of the socio-economic, the de facto head of all the khalifas or religious functionaries in the region. Through oral transmission from the keepers of the tradition, I got to know firsthand the recent history of the Ismaili community, the vicissitudes that they had just faced in the aftermath of the first part of the civil war, but also their expectations with regard to the religious education of the Jamaat. I came to realize that their preservation of religious identity had been largely through the performance of a funerary rite and a religious text, Wajh-e-Din, written by the renowned Ismaili Dai of the Fatimid era called Nasr-e-Khosrau, who spent the last part of his life in Badakhshan. I realized how woefully inadequate my knowledge was in trying to make sense of what I was seeing and hearing, as I tended to see matters through my own lens, which had been honed by a tradition of Ismailism, which was much more recent and from a different socio-cultural context. I kept on asking myself, how do these people identify as Ismailis? Do they have Jamaat Khanas as we do? Do they have councils as in many other parts of the world? Do they have daily congregational prayers and practices? Do they have a formalized institutional structure? And more particularly, do they even know what the Imam of the time looks like? For me, it was a steep learning curve, but I was very fortunate to have Shahzada Mohamed with me and Dr. Nuruddin Aladini, an IIS graduate from Iran who was working in this area at the time. I was very interested in how religious education was imparted to the children and how faith was transmitted down the generations. I realized that culture played an important role in the preservation of Ismaili identity, but I also realized that that identity was fluid and was undergoing a massive transformation. Ismaili identity then was not as defined as it is today, for none of the community institutions as we know them today existed then. And yet, there was a feeling of solidarity, of belonging, and of hope. I recall with great admiration a Khalifa clutching a piece of bread and dipping it in salt, as he emphasized how they all knew that the Imam of the time was with them. The Imam was never going to abandon them, and Nasser Khosrau had assured them, and that he would be there at the time of need. And lo and behold, the Imam came to the rescue. Their belief was palpable. I heard stories of the visit of Pir Sabzali in 1923 and the difficulties he encountered, his arrest and the subsequent Stalinist purge, and the forced disappearances of many Khalifas. Among those who disappeared were stalwarts such as Chinor Imomov, an engineer and leading functionary of the Communist Party, and Shirin Shoaib Shah Timur, a well-known Bolshevist. Ismaili identity at that time was undergoing a massive transition, and while internal migration was a physical fact, the Jamaat was undergoing a mental migration as Tajikistan was battling to forge its new identity. Society as a whole was transitioning from a command Soviet-styled collective economic system to one based on a neoliberal Western capitalistic ethic. This called for a new approach to landholding and indeed to agricultural production. The Soviet era and its Marxist-Leninist ideology had an enormous impact on how people were perceived, and some of those tropes gained greater currency as specific groups in the country jockeyed for political power in the post-Soviet world. All these developments are beautifully described in Ahmed Rashid's well-known book, The Resurgence of Central Asia, Islam or Nationalism. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ensuing war in Tajikistan, as well as the rise of a number of independent nation states in Central Asia, many new developments have taken place. Democracy has been under trial, and many minorities have faced further challenges. We continue to see civil strife in the ex-Soviet Union, not to mention the rise of the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan, leading to the flight of millions of people who went first to Pakistan and India, and in some cases to Iran and other countries in the area, on their way to make a home for themselves in countries of the Western world, such as Canada, the United States, and the European Union. Migration, which is at the heart of this conference, raises a number of critical issues, such as how do people preserve their identity in the face of an ever-changing world? Is there such a thing as one identity, or are there a number of identities? Is each one of us a Matryoshka doll carrying within us a specific identity, subsumed by another identity, subsumed by yet another identity, and so forth? All these identities coexist harmoniously with each other in a well-ordered structure, which, as a metaphor, illustrates the unity of body, soul, mind, heart, and spirit. My strong belief is that identity is never static. It is an ever-evolving phenomenon, and it shapes itself according to the environment in which a person finds him or herself. That environment itself is ever-changing, as it is influenced by a number of forces, and these may be national, international, global, or geopolitical. They could also be climatic, as Dr. Elnazarov mentioned this morning. And within these changes, questions keep on arising, such as how do we maintain our culture? How do we preserve our heritage? What is our identity? And above all, where do we actually belong? These are very important questions, and we need to keep raising them as we navigate through the whitewater rapids of acculturation. And here I commend the Central Asian Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies for pioneering this endeavor and bringing together a host of scholars who are engaged in this area of research. as I look to my own diasporic search as an Ismaili Muslim from Africa, I often ask myself, who am I and where do I really belong? I realize that I am a child of a migration occasioned by the forces that were unleashed by the end of empire. I felt the winds of change. They propelled me. I rode on their crest. They inspired me. And they gave me hope. I also saw these winds unleash a great negative force which led to the expulsion of thousands of people. And I saw these very winds revisit the areas from which they first blew. And in many cases, they brought with them new wisdom and the very areas to the very areas where they once wrought havoc. I realized that as a child of migration, I preceded the winds of change. For the Indians of Africa have been part of a migratory trend that goes back over 1,000 years. The great Greek navigator Hippolus wrote around 50 CE that Indians, mostly from the Gujarat, were part of the maritime trade in the Indian Ocean that brought the influences of the greater world to the shores of Eastern Africa, and that Indians, contrary to the way in which they were being portrayed, were part of the historic maritime trade of the Indian Ocean. Over a millennium in Eastern Africa, various invasions took place. First, an invasion of trade by the Arabs, and then later the inroads made by European colonialism, first the Portuguese and Spanish, and then the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Germans. During all this time, colonial powers decided to categorize people for different imperial reasons. These were times when the world could still be divided into spheres of influence, such as in 1494, when under the Treaty of Tordesillas, Pope Alexander VI brokered an agreement dividing the world into two, giving the Spanish the rights to all lands westward of a line through the Atlantic Ocean, and to the Portuguese, all lands east of that line. Not surprisingly, less than 200 years later, the Portuguese themselves, in an act of supreme bounty, presented Bombay and Tangiers as part of a dowry to the English king Charles II when he married the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza. Let us now fast forward to the early 20th century, when Queen Victoria, not wishing to be outdone, is reputed to have gifted Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanganyika to her grandson, the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II. An apocryphal story maybe, which nevertheless reflects the proprietorial instincts of the colonial powers who saw the world as part of their real estate that they could alienate freely, heedless of the impact this would have on millions of people. Many of these idiosyncrasies led to major migrations by people in search of newer pastures, bringing with them newer opportunities, but also newer problems. These problems, we have seen, cannot be approached with simplistic solutions. And here we need modern tools of analysis to understand how human beings make meaning of their lives. The 2023 World Development Report that Professor Zayn Kassam referred to this morning, entitled Migrants, Refugees and Societies, highlights the fact that migration is a major development challenge today. And the report emphasizes, as she said, that almost 184 million people, 2.3% of the world's population, live outside the country of their nationality. Almost half of them are in low and middle income countries. The report raises the question of what lies ahead. It underscores that as the world struggles to cope with global economic imbalances, diverging demographic trends, and climate change, migration will become a necessity at all levels of income. If managed well, it can become a force for prosperity, can help achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The report proposes an integrated framework to maximize the development impacts of cross-border movements on both the destination and the origin countries, and on migrants and refugees themselves. The framework it offers draws from labor economics and international law, and rests on a match and motive matrix that focuses on two factors, namely, how closely the skills and attributes of migrants match the needs of the destination countries, and what motives underlie these movements. This approach, the report states, would enable policymakers to distinguish between different types of movements so that they can design immigration policies for each. International cooperation will be critical for the effective management of migration. Well, so much for policy making and for the international community to come to grips with the phenomenon of migration that has become a distinguishing characteristic of our time, primarily by our inability to deal with it in a creative manner. This brings me back to our scholarship agenda and the basis on which this conference is taking place today. People do worry about their culture and its preservation. Often, anxiety is heightened in the early days of settlement, when a group of people arrive in a new country which seems alien to them. Your culture needs to be carefully unpacked from what often is projected as tradition, because often in the process of resettlement, we begin to see clashes between our younger generation and our older one, each inhabiting different worlds. The new generation growing up in a new westernized milieu tend to view their rights as being trampled on the altar of tradition that does not speak to them. Here, while the notion of tradition needs to be viewed with empathy and compassion, it should not be allowed to degenerate into traditionalism, which, in the words of the 20th century scholar of Christianity, Yaroslav Pelikan, is the dead faith of the living as opposed to the living faith of the dead. A clash of this nature could express itself in a rights-based discourse, often taking the coloration of the violation of specific individual human rights. Here, particular care needs to be taken to ensure that intergenerational harmony is maintained and is always seen as a cornerstone of a family's unity. There is then the question of history. And here we need to ask, how do newly arrived immigrants think of their history? From where do they source their history? And here I do not mean only their ancient history, but also their recent experiences, and how does all this impinge on their identity? In the case of the 1972 Uganda Asian expulsion, I was fortunate to be on the steering committee of the 50-year commemoration of the expulsion. And I know for a fact that a great deal of the memories of the event have been lost. This is due in some cases to that generation having passed without anyone having recorded their experiences. In many cases, this was compounded by the reticence of the early immigrants speaking to their children about their own experiences. I have come across children who still carry the trauma of being uprooted and impoverished purely through witnessing the pain of their parents, a phenomenon similar to that suffered by the children of Holocaust survivors. In migratory experiences, people do face racism, but at the same time, there are myriad examples of great kindness and generosity. This is where projects of oral history become so important, and I am happy to note that here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, there are endeavors to capture this rich heritage, and I might mention here the wonderful Ismaili Heritage Project being shaped and managed by Dr. Fayaz Alibai. This then takes us to identity and the questions, how do we How do we handle the plurality of identities that make up each of our beings? And how do we ensure that these do not clash? There is a wealth of literature from various different traditions, ranging from Amartya Sen and Arundhati Roy from the subcontinent to diasporic writers such as Hanif Qureshi, Salman Rushdie, Elif Shafak, and Amin Malouf, as well as earlier post-colonial writers such as Chinua Achebe and Wallace Soyinka from Nigeria, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenya. In our own Jamaat, we have writers such as Moez Basenji, a prize-winning novelist, Sikina Karmali, Zarina Bimji, and many others. There are outstanding filmmakers such as Mira Nair, Deepa Mehta, and Gurinder Chadha, and indeed the prince of all storytellers, V.S. Naipaul of Trinidad. But while good literature is transnational, we may wish to explore the historiography on the subject and search for Central Asian voices as well, both historical and contemporary. One may start with Al-Biruni, the 11th century Persian scholar and polymath of the Islamic Golden Age, who spent over 13 years of his life in India, studying a different culture from his own, and writing the book Tariq al-Hind, which, according to Frederick Starr, an American expert on Eurasian affairs, is still one of the greatest achievements of all time in the area of interdisciplinary social science, international studies, theology, intellectual history, and the history of science. With regard to contemporary writing, the work of Chingiz Itmatov, a towering figure on the Kyrgyz literary firmament, is a good example. While his work draws on folklore, not in the ancient sense of the word, but in the recreation and synthesizing of oral tales in the context of contemporary life, he also touches on Kyrgyzstan's transformation from having been part of the Russian Empire since its annexation of most of the Central Asia in the 19th century to a republic of the USSR. Perhaps here, a closer link with the Aga Khan Humanities Project at the University of Central Asia may be worth consideration, since its main goal is to promote the ideas of humanity, human agency, and pluralism among people. Its linkage with over 60 academic institutions in the region seems to be an ideal fit for the type of work you are envisaging as a follow-up of this conference. This then brings me back to my own perennial search for an identity. I open all the matryoshka dolls of which I am made up and re-examine the pictures to see which of them once inspired me and whether they still continue to do so. And here I go back to my memoir, Into That Heaven of Freedom, which ends with the words with which the book actually starts, from one of India's greatest poets, musicians, educationists, and artists, Rabindranath Tagore, from his book Gitanjali, for which he was awarded the 1913 Nobel Prize for Literature, in which he states, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake." To me, that is my new matryoshka doll, and I feel it sits beautifully with all the other dolls which I continue to re-examine each day in my quest for that single identity, which eludes me as it just does not exist. Knowing full well, as Maya Angelou in her book, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, reminds us when she says that the ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place to where we can go as we are, and not be questioned. The search continues. Thank you very much.